The morning air carried that quiet stillness that often settles over old cemeteries. Not silence exactly, just a soft hush, the kind that makes people speak a little slower and breathe a little deeper. A group of motorcycles stood lined along the gravel path. Their chrome parts caught the pale morning light. Most of the riders stood back respectfully, hands folded or tucked in their jacket pockets. Near a small headstone, a broad-shouldered biker knelt in the damp grass. His name was Calvin Rhodes. Calvin was 56 years old, with gray working its way through his thick beard and long hair tied loosely behind his neck. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, reminders of roads traveled, old friends lost, and years that had gone by faster than he expected. But right now, those strong tattooed arms were trembling. His hands covered his face as his shoulders shook quietly. In front of him stood a small grave marker with a simple name carved into the stone. Emily Rhodes. His daughter. Or at least, the daughter he believed he had buried. The other bikers understood grief in their own way. Many of them had known Calvin for years. They had ridden thousands of miles beside him. They had shared campfires, roadside diners, and the long quiet stretches of highway that gave a man time to think. So they waited respectfully. Some looked away. Some stared at the ground. No one wanted to interrupt a father saying goodbye. The morning breeze moved gently through the trees, rustling dry leaves across the grass. And that was when a small voice spoke. Soft. Careful. Sir. Calvin didn't move at first. He thought it might be someone from the group. But the voice came again. Sir, your daughter isn't dead. Calvin slowly lowered his hands. Standing beside the grave was a thin boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. His brown hair was messy, and his jacket was 2 sizes too big for him. The sleeves hung past his wrists. In one hand, the boy held a small plastic grocery bag with a few apples and a loaf of bread inside. His shoes were worn and dusty. The kind of worn that told a quiet story. The boy looked nervous but determined. Calvin stared at him, confusion mixing with grief. What did you say, son? Calvin asked, his voice rough. The boy shifted his weight. My name's Lucas, sir, he said quietly. I didn't mean to bother you. Calvin wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. You're not bothering me, he said gently. But what you said, that's not possible. Lucas glanced down at the grave marker. Then back up at Calvin. I've seen her, the boy said. A murmur passed through the group of bikers standing behind them. One of the men stepped forward slightly, but Calvin raised a hand to stop him. He kept his eyes on the boy. You've seen who? Calvin asked slowly. Emily, Lucas replied. Calvin's heart thumped hard in his chest. The name hung in the cool morning air. Lucas pointed quietly toward the road beyond the cemetery. There's a little clinic about 4 blocks that way, he said. White building with green windows. Calvin's voice grew tight. Why would my daughter be there? Lucas hesitated. Because she works there, he said softly. The bikers looked at one another. Calvin felt the ground tilt slightly under him. That can't be, he whispered. My Emily, she passed away 12 years ago. Car accident. Lucas looked puzzled. I don't think so, he said. The lady there, she said her name was Emily Rhodes. Calvin's breathing grew uneven. For a long moment he said nothing. Grief has a strange way of settling inside a person over the years. It becomes part of the bones, part of the quiet spaces in the heart. But sometimes, just sometimes, a small spark of hope can slip through the cracks. Calvin studied the boy carefully. Lucas didn't look like someone trying to trick anyone. He looked tired. Hungry. And honest. How do you know her? Calvin asked gently. Lucas lifted the grocery bag slightly. She gives me food sometimes, he said. And soup when it's cold. Calvin's chest tightened. What does she look like? He asked. Lucas thought for a moment. She's got long brown hair, he said. And she smiles a lot, even when people are sad. Calvin closed his eyes briefly. Emily had always smiled like that. Even as a little girl. He remembered her riding on the back of his motorcycle when she was 16, laughing into the wind as they drove along old country roads. He remembered her helping strangers without thinking twice. Helping had always been her way. Calvin stood slowly. His knees felt stiff after kneeling. The other bikers watched quietly. One of them, a tall man named Raymond Carter, stepped closer. "You okay, brother?" Raymond asked. Calvin nodded slowly. "I think I need to take a short ride," he said. Lucas stepped back nervously as the large men moved. Calvin crouched down in front of him. "Would you mind showing me that clinic?" he asked. Lucas blinked. "You're not mad?" he asked. Calvin shook his head gently. "No, son. Not at all." Lucas gave a small nod. "I can show you." A few minutes later, the motorcycles rolled slowly out of the cemetery. Lucas sat behind Raymond on the back of his bike, holding carefully onto the leather jacket. The ride only lasted 5 minutes. But for Calvin, it felt like a journey through years of memories. They stopped in front of a small medical clinic. White walls. Green window frames. Exactly as Lucas described. Calvin removed his helmet slowly. His hands felt colder than before. Inside the clinic, the smell of antiseptic and coffee filled the air. A few elderly patients sat quietly in the waiting room. Behind the counter stood a woman organizing files. She looked up as the door opened. Her brown hair was tied back loosely. Her eyes were warm and calm. And when she saw Calvin, the folders slipped from her hands. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Calvin's voice barely came out as a whisper. "Emily." Tears filled the woman's eyes instantly. "Dad?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Emily ran forward and wrapped her arms around him. Calvin held her tightly, his large hands trembling against her back. 12 years of grief washed away in quiet tears. Later, after things had settled and stories were shared, the truth slowly came together. 12 years earlier, the car accident had been terrible. Emily had been injured and unconscious. A hospital mix-up had led to a tragic misunderstanding when another young woman with similar identification had been mistaken for her. By the time the mistake was discovered, Emily had already moved to another state during her recovery, believing her father had abandoned her. And Calvin had spent more than a decade believing he had buried his child. Sometimes life's strangest twists come not from cruelty, but from simple human error. And sometimes healing arrives in the most unexpected way. Like a small boy carrying a bag of apples. Later that afternoon, Calvin sat outside the clinic on a wooden bench. Emily sat beside him. Lucas sat across from them eating a sandwich. Calvin looked at the boy with deep gratitude. "You changed a lot of lives today, son," he said. Lucas shrugged shyly. "I just told the truth," he said. Emily smiled gently. "That's often the most powerful thing a person can do." The sun moved slowly across the sky as the afternoon warmed. Calvin leaned back and watched the quiet street. At 56, he had thought life had already shown him most of what it had to offer. But that day reminded him of something important. Life still has surprises left, even in the later chapters. And sometimes kindness, even from the smallest voices, can lead people back home. Lucas finished his sandwich and smiled. For the first time in a long while, all three of them felt something warm and steady in their hearts. Not just relief. Not just happiness. But the quiet comfort of knowing that sometimes, life gives second chances. And when it does, they're worth every mile of the journey.